The air over Tehran felt unusually tense that morning, thick with an almost tangible sense of anticipation. Citizens moved about their daily routines with cautious eyes, glancing at the government buildings that had long symbolized authority, now appearing fragile under the weight of unrest. Over the past few months, protests had erupted across the country, fueled by economic despair and the growing frustration of a populace that had felt unheard for too long. The streets that once buzzed with casual chatter now hummed with the underlying anxiety of potential confrontation. In neighborhoods across the capital, families huddled together following news updates, unsure whether the city they knew would survive the turbulence that seemed to gather momentum by the hour. Inside the barracks on the outskirts of Tehran, commanders gathered in a dimly lit room, the air thick with cigar smoke and the tension of secrecy. The conversation, typically routine, carried a weight that suggested more than tactical maneuvers. It was about loyalty, survival, and the unspoken question of allegiance. For decades, the Iranian military had been a pillar of the regime's strength, meticulously structured and fiercely disciplined. But whispers circulating through the ranks hinted at cracks within this once monolithic institution. Soldiers, officers, and even elite units were beginning to question not just their orders, but the very ideology they had been trained to defend without hesitation. Morale, once unshakable, now wavered under the influence of national unrest and stories of neighboring countries' shifts in power. By noon, news of a small but significant defection began to circulate among the public and the state-controlled media alike. At first, it was almost dismissed as rumor, a single battalion refusing orders, a few officers expressing discontent, but within hours, the story gained traction. A video, shaky and grainy, appeared on encrypted messaging platforms, showing soldiers lowering their weapons in a symbolic gesture of protest. Their uniforms, once a sign of unquestionable authority, now seemed paradoxically fragile. The faces of the soldiers, determined yet apprehensive, captured the imagination of viewers worldwide. For citizens in Tehran and beyond, the video was more than news. It was a moment of validation, evidence that loyalty to the state could be questioned, that the system was not as invincible as it had long claimed to be. Meanwhile, the regime scrambled to control the narrative. Statements were released, insisting that the armed forces remained unified, dismissing claims of defections as fabricated lies by foreign agents. Social media posts were censored, and journalists were warned against spreading unverified information. Yet, despite these efforts, the story had already taken root. In quiet corners of Tehran, office workers and shopkeepers whispered about the possibility that the military, long seen as untouchable, could fracture from within. This uncertainty was both terrifying and exhilarating, a potent mixture that fueled conversations in cafes and private homes alike. People debated the implications, pondering whether this was the beginning of a seismic shift or a fleeting moment of dissent that would be crushed before it could gain momentum. Beyond the capital, the ripple effects were even more pronounced. Provinces with historically tense relationships with central authorities reported subtle signs of military hesitation. Troops assigned to monitor civilian activity acted with unusual restraint, and in some towns, soldiers were seen engaging with local communities rather than enforcing strict orders. Analysts speculated that communication within the ranks had been compromised, that some officers had quietly begun to align with the voices of the people rather than the directives of the central government. The symbolic nature of these acts was clear. Allegiance could no longer be assumed, it had to be demonstrated. The very concept of authority, once rooted in fear and discipline, now faced the unpredictable element of conscience. In the corridors of political power, uncertainty bred paranoia. Advisors and ministers met behind closed doors, debating contingency plans. Would loyal units be sufficient to quell the unrest if defections continued to spread? Could the regime leverage propaganda or fear to reinforce obedience, or had a threshold been crossed where ideology alone was insufficient to command compliance? Each scenario carried immense risks. The leadership, historical reliance on a disciplined military. To maintain internal control suddenly seemed like a fragile strategy rather than a guaranteed safeguard. The reality that a portion of the armed forces might shift its loyalty struck at the very heart of the regime security architecture, suggesting that even long-standing mechanisms of control were vulnerable to disruption. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens watched and waited, their reactions ranging from cautious optimism to apprehensive fear. For many, the defection of troops represented hope, a tangible sign that the voices of the people could influence even the most rigid institutions. For others, it was a reminder of how fragile social order could become, a reminder that power vacuums often invited chaos. Families debated in hushed tones, whether this moment could be a turning point or whether it was merely a symbolic gesture that would ultimately be contained. Across the country, discussions shifted from survival to strategy. as citizens considered the possibilities of negotiation, resistance, and reform in the face of shifting loyalties. International observers also began to take notice. Governments and media outlets worldwide speculated on the implications of the apparent shift within Iran's military. Some analysts warned of potential instability that could reverberate across the region, affecting geopolitical alliances and economic markets. Others saw it as a rare glimpse of internal dissent in a country often perceived as monolithic in its governance. The global community, while distant from the streets of Tehran, recognized that the loyalties of the military could serve as a powerful indicator of the regime's future. A single unit changing sides could have implications far beyond Iran's borders, influencing foreign policy calculations, trade agreements, and diplomatic negotiations. The international community watched these developments with intense interest. Analysts in Washington, Brussels, and New Delhi speculated on potential outcomes, weighing scenarios ranging from full-scale military mutiny to limited symbolic gestures that would be quickly contained. Regional actors, particularly those with historical tensions with Iran, recalculated strategies, considering both risks and opportunities in the event of sustained military defection. Investors and policymakers monitored oil markets and trade flows, anticipating the economic fallout of a prolonged period of uncertainty. Even distant observers recognized that the loyalty of Iran's military was a central determinant of both domestic stability and regional security. A shift in allegiance, even partial, could have ramifications extending far beyond national borders. Amid this geopolitical scrutiny, the human cost remained ever present. Families of defecting soldiers lived with constant anxiety, uncertain whether relatives would be detained, injured, or worse. Those who stayed loyal faced moral dilemmas: obedience to orders versus ethical responsibility to fellow citizens. Every decision carried profound personal consequences, and each choice rippled through communities in unpredictable ways. Civilian support became crucial, with neighborhoods offering shelter, food, or information to defecting units, creating a network of clandestine assistance that reinforced the movement. The interplay between military decision-making and civilian engagement highlighted the intricate dynamics of loyalty, morality, and survival in a society under strain. Inside Tehran, the city's atmosphere became a strange blend of cautious optimism and restrained panic. Streets were populated with soldiers and civilians, each acutely aware of the other's potential choices. Markets operated under a heightened sense of vigilance, schools continued with altered schedules, and government offices remained functional but tense. Public spaces became arenas of subtle observation, where body language and interactions were scrutinized for signs of loyalty or defection. Everyday life persisted, but beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was unfolding. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, contributed to a growing narrative that the regime's grip on power was not absolute, and that allegiance could, in fact, be contested. Meanwhile, strategic thinking among the defecting forces deepened. Leaders within these units coordinated plans for larger mobilizations, assessing risk and potential impact. Communication networks were fortified, and contingency plans prepared for the inevitable response from loyalist forces. This phase of organization required both patience and discretion. Any misstep could lead to the rapid collapse of their efforts. Yet, the soldiers pressed on, motivated by a combination of ethical conviction, hope for change, and the recognition that the balance of power within the military was shifting in unprecedented ways. Their actions, once isolated, were gradually forming a pattern that suggested a broader realignment of loyalty across the nation. By the end of this period, the narrative of defection had solidified in the public consciousness. Tehran and other cities were no longer merely witnessing isolated acts of dissent. They were observing a potential tipping point. The psychological impact of knowing that some soldiers had chosen conscience over orders was profound. Citizens, military analysts, and government officials alike recognized that the situation had entered uncharted territory. The regime's traditional tools of control, propaganda, fear, and strict hierarchy, were being challenged not only by civilians, but by the very forces historically entrusted with their enforcement. For Iran, the realization dawned that the loyalty of its military was no longer guaranteed, and the consequences of that shift were only beginning to unfold. The city of Tehran seemed to hold its breath as the first signs of organized resistance from the defecting troops became visible. Small convoys of military vehicles, once symbols of unquestioned authority, now moved cautiously through the streets, escorted not by checkpoints enforcing control, but by civilians signaling safe passage. The streets, previously tense with anxious observation, now carried a palpable electricity, as though the entire city was aware of a historical moment unfolding. Ordinary citizens lined sidewalks, some with cameras, others with nothing but their eyes, recording the defiance of soldiers who had chosen conscience over command. These were no longer isolated acts of rebellion. They were coordinated moves that spoke of preparation, strategy, and an emerging network within the armed forces. Inside the government's central command, panic had begun to seep into what had long been a rigid hierarchy. Senior officials debated the implications of this coordinated defection, their voices rising in heated argument over whether to call in reinforcements or attempt negotiations. For decades, the Iranian military had been regarded as a pillar of stability, a force whose loyalty was assumed without question. Now, however, the premise of unwavering obedience was shattered. The leadership faced a dilemma: deploy loyalist forces and risk igniting full-scale conflict, or attempt dialogue with the defecting units, acknowledging that the soldiers they had trained for years might no longer respond to orders. The debate was not merely strategic, it was existential. The defecting units, meanwhile, were consolidating power and gathering intelligence. Officers who had once executed orders without hesitation now coordinated movements in secrecy, communicating via encrypted devices and carefully planning each action. Supply lines, previously dependent on government oversight, were rerouted, and local populations provided essential support, offering food, shelter, and intelligence on loyalist troop positions. Each successful maneuver emboldened the soldiers and civilians alike, reinforcing the notion that collective action could challenge even the most formidable military hierarchy. The psychological impact of these coordinated movements was as significant as the physical, as the knowledge that soldiers could act independently undermined decades of centralized authority. In districts surrounding Tehran, small-scale confrontations began to occur. Loyalist units, tasked with restoring order, encountered soldiers refusing to follow orders or directly supporting civilian protests. These encounters were tense but largely nonviolent at first, consisting of standoffs, careful negotiations, and the exchange of strategic information. Civilians often acted as intermediaries, bridging gaps between soldiers on opposing sides and facilitating peaceful resolutions. Yet, beneath the surface, every interaction was a test of loyalty, a moment where decisions could tip the balance between restraint and escalation. The streets had become a chessboard, with human lives as the pieces, and each move carried weighty consequences. The psychological dimension of defection became increasingly evident. Soldiers who had switched sides reported a sense of empowerment, coupled with a deep awareness of personal risk. Each action, whether refusing an order, protecting civilians, or sharing intelligence, was a calculated decision with potential consequences for themselves and their families. Those who remained loyal experienced a different strain: pressure to enforce authority while observing colleagues and subordinates act independently. The resulting tension created an environment in which fear, uncertainty, and ethical reflection intersected, reshaping traditional hierarchies and challenging assumptions about obedience and morality in the military context. At the same time, public perception shifted dramatically. Ordinary citizens, witnessing acts of courage and coordination by defecting troops, began to recognize the fragility of the state's narrative. Propaganda broadcasts, once unquestioned, were now met with skepticism, as the reality on the ground contradicted official messaging. Crowds grew in size and confidence, emboldened by the tangible signs that the government's control was neither absolute nor unchallenged. Civic spaces transformed into arenas of mutual observation, where citizens and defecting soldiers shared unspoken alliances, each act of solidarity reinforcing the possibility of systemic change. In this environment, loyalty was no longer assumed. It was demonstrated through action. International observers intensified their scrutiny, analyzing every video, report, and signal from the unfolding events. Governments with vested interests in the region recalculated strategies, weighing risks and opportunities in the event of a broader military shift. Analysts debated whether these defections signaled the beginning of internal collapse, a temporary strategic maneuver, or a lasting redefinition of loyalty within the armed forces. The global stakes became intertwined with local actions, as the defection of relatively small units suggested potential vulnerabilities in what had long been considered a secure and disciplined military. In essence, Tehran had become both a national and international stage, where symbolic acts of defiance reverberated far beyond city limits. Meanwhile, tensions reached a boiling point in one strategic district, where a loyalist unit encountered a significant contingent of defecting soldiers attempting to secure a communication hub. The standoff was tense and silent, punctuated only by the distant sounds of city life and the nervous murmurs of civilians observing from nearby rooftops and streets. Officers on both sides measured each move carefully. The possibility of violence loomed, yet restraint prevailed due to mutual recognition of human and political stakes. For the defectors, success meant controlling a critical node that could enable coordination with other units. For loyalists, failure could signal the beginning of widespread breakdown in military obedience. Every decision was fraught with consequences, highlighting the precarious nature of loyalty and the complexity of real-time strategy. As the day progressed, the defecting forces demonstrated an unexpected level of discipline and strategic acumen. Civilians assisted in surveillance, identified loyalist movements, and facilitated communication between units in a decentralized network. This collaboration blurred the line between military and civilian action, creating a hybrid form of resistance that combined professional training with grassroots intelligence. The result was a dynamic, adaptive strategy that confounded loyalist planners and challenged assumptions about predictability in military operations. Each successful maneuver reinforced confidence among defectors and supporters alike, creating momentum that threatened to shift the broader balance of power. The regime's response became increasingly desperate. Orders were issued to consolidate loyalist forces, checkpoints were reinforced, and intelligence operations intensified. Yet, each attempt to regain control was met with strategic evasion, nonviolent resistance, or active defiance by the defecting troops. The psychological impact of these actions was profound, as both loyalist soldiers and civilian observers recognized that authority no longer guaranteed compliance. Trust, discipline, and hierarchy, pillars of military cohesion, were now subject to active contestation, creating a situation that traditional command structures were ill-prepared to manage. The very concept of obedience had been transformed into a matter of negotiation, ethics, and strategic calculation. In the evenings, the city's skyline reflected an eerie calm, belying the ongoing strategic maneuvering below. Residents debated potential outcomes, their conversations a mixture of hope, fear, and speculation. Social networks continued to circulate real-time updates, and each confirmed defection served as both inspiration and warning. Families of defecting soldiers remained on edge, acutely aware of both the risks and the symbolic significance of their relatives' choices. The city had entered a period of collective anticipation, where each night brought the possibility of further escalation or a dramatic breakthrough. For Tehran, the events were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a growing narrative in which loyalty, conscience, and courage intersected to redefine the nation's trajectory. By the end of this period, it became clear that a tipping point had been reached. Defections were no longer sporadic. They were coordinated, disciplined, and strategically significant. The city, and by extension the nation, had entered uncharted territory. Ordinary citizens and defecting soldiers alike recognized the fragile nature of authority and the power of collective action. The events unfolding in Tehran were no longer a test of isolated courage, but a potential turning point that could reshape the future of governance, loyalty, and civic engagement in Iran. The balance of power, once assumed immutable, was now subject to choice, conscience, and action. The city of Tehran, once simmering with cautious tension, now vibrated with a sense of inevitability. The defecting troops had expanded their influence, securing key districts, communication hubs, and supply lines, while coordinating closely with civilian networks. Citizens, once passive observers of political unrest, had become active participants, guiding soldiers through streets, warning of loyalist movements, and offering aid wherever possible. This collaboration, forged from necessity and hope, transformed the city into a theater of strategy and human resilience. Every alleyway and rooftop became part of a network, each person contributing to a movement that sought to redefine the balance of power in a nation long dominated by rigid hierarchies. The loyalist forces, previously confident in their control, found themselves increasingly isolated. Commands sent from central authorities were delayed, intercepted, or openly defied. Units stationed on the outskirts hesitated to engage, unsure if the soldiers on the other side would remain obedient or join the defectors. A sense of uncertainty had taken root, eroding both morale and strategic clarity. For the first time in decades, the regime faced a situation where authority alone could not enforce compliance, and every decision carried profound implications. The balance of power had shifted from centralized command to decentralized, unpredictable action, an evolution that would determine the fate of the city and potentially the country. As the hours passed, small skirmishes broke out between defecting and loyalist units, but violence remained limited. Defectors, aware of the symbolic and strategic importance of restraint, sought to assert control without unnecessary bloodshed. Civilians played a crucial role, mediating tensions and ensuring that confrontations remained contained. The city became a delicate balance of negotiation and tactical maneuvering, each encounter a test of discipline, loyalty, and moral judgment. The psychological impact of these engagements was significant. Loyalists saw the courage and cohesion of their counterparts, while civilians witnessed the possibility that authority could be challenged, altered, and perhaps redefined entirely. The leadership within the defecting forces emerged as a decisive element. Officers who had once been enforcers now became strategists, coordinating movements, sharing intelligence, and ensuring the safety of both soldiers and civilians. Their ability to maintain discipline while navigating complex moral and logistical challenges set the tone for the larger movement. Soldiers, empowered by these leaders, acted with a sense of purpose and clarity, understanding that their actions carried symbolic weight as much as tactical significance. Every decision, from securing a communication center to providing safe passage through contested streets, was a deliberate step toward shaping a new reality within Tehran. Across the city, civilians adapted to the new reality. Local markets became informal intelligence hubs, community centers provided safe houses, and ordinary citizens shared updates on troop movements with remarkable precision. The collaboration between soldiers and civilians created a network that was both resilient and adaptive, capable of responding to unexpected challenges with creativity and resolve. Trust, once assumed only within military ranks, now extended into the streets, forming a collective consciousness that was both strategic and deeply human. The city had transformed into a living organism, responsive to threats and opportunities, defined not by rigid command, but by mutual cooperation and shared purpose. International observers continued to monitor events closely, noting that the defection of troops represented not merely a domestic crisis, but a potential geopolitical turning point. Analysts debated whether the coordinated actions could lead to systemic change, a negotiated settlement, or continued instability. Governments considered the implications for diplomacy, trade, and regional security. Yet, the most significant transformation was internal. The people of Tehran, alongside the defecting troops, had demonstrated that agency, conscience, and collective action could challenge long-standing structures of power. The narrative was no longer defined solely by the government. It was being rewritten by those who chose courage over compliance. In the climax of this unfolding drama, a symbolic confrontation emerged at the city's central square. A loyalist unit, ordered to reassert control, approached the area where defecting troops and thousands of civilians had gathered. Tension crackled in the air as both sides paused, each aware that the next actions would carry immense consequences. Then, in a moment that would define the movement, the defecting officers stepped forward and engaged in dialogue, seeking to prevent violence while asserting control over the area. The loyalists hesitated, confronted by both the disciplined strategy and the moral conviction of their counterparts. Civilians, standing side by side with the defectors, reinforced the message. This was a moment of conscience, negotiation, and collective assertion of agency. Ultimately, the loyalist forces retreated, not defeated by brute force, but convinced of the strength and legitimacy of the defection. The square, once a site of potential violence, became a stage for a new order, a demonstration that authority rooted in fear could be contested and, in certain circumstances, reshaped. Civilians celebrated cautiously, aware that challenges remained, but inspired by the visible proof that change was possible. Soldiers who had defected were both heroes and symbols. Their actions represented a departure from unquestioning obedience, a demonstration that loyalty could be earned through conscience rather than imposed by command. The city, in that moment, seemed suspended between past structures of control and the unfolding promise of transformation. In the aftermath, the narrative of Tehran shifted. News outlets, both domestic and international, highlighted the unprecedented events, coordinated defections, civilian cooperation, and the avoidance of large-scale violence. Analysts debated the potential long-term impact, but the psychological and symbolic significance was undeniable. For the people of Tehran, the defection of troops became a testament to the power of ethical decision-making, strategic coordination, and communal support. The military, while still a powerful institution, had been shown to be fallible, and the citizens had learned that collective action could influence even the most rigid hierarchies. This moment, forever etched in memory, marked a turning point in both perception and reality. As the city settled into a cautious stability, the lessons of these events resonated beyond Tehran. Soldiers reflected on the importance of conscience. Civilians recognized their capacity to effect change, and observers worldwide understood the fragility of authority in the face of coordinated moral action. The city had been transformed not through chaos alone, but through deliberate, disciplined, and ethically guided defection. It was a story of courage, collaboration, and the enduring human capacity to challenge power when it is exercised without accountability. The events in Tehran served as a reminder that even the most formidable institutions are ultimately composed of individuals, each capable of choice and action. As this chapter of the story concluded, the people of Tehran faced the future with a blend of cautious optimism and sober awareness. The journey had revealed vulnerabilities in systems long considered unassailable, and the city had experienced the profound consequences of decisions guided by conscience rather than obedience. While uncertainty remained, a new narrative had been established. Loyalty could shift, collective action could succeed, and ordinary citizens, alongside courageous soldiers, could influence the trajectory of a nation. The events, though rooted in the immediacy of conflict, ultimately affirmed the enduring human capacity for choice, courage, and transformation. And with that, our story comes to an end. If you found this journey through Tehran's streets and the brave actions of those who defied the odds compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth scripts, stories, and analyses. Your support helps us continue to bring these narratives to life and explore the untold dynamics that shape our world. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories where courage and conscience meet the challenges of history.